I titled this message, Depraved New World, The Impact of Darwinism, of Darwinian Evolution on Society. A real short, sweet way of titling that is just Social Darwinism. Kind of the social or societal consequences of the evolutionary worldview. And we're seeing a lot of that spelled out today. Now, if I can remember how to, well, first off, the evolutionary morality, did I go too many? Yeah, I did. First, the traditional morality. Let me just make sure. Yeah, okay, I got this. All right, in the Declaration of Independence, we see that our experience with freedom here in this country is based on the belief that all men are created equal, and that God has given us inalienable rights that cannot be taken away from us. You know, too many people, they look at the Bill of Rights and they think, well, those are our constitutional rights, as if our government gave them to us. No, our founding fathers recognized that God gave us these rights, and because we're human, we have these rights. And we no longer hold to this, which is really unfortunate. And we're going to see the movers and shakers that lead the pro-abortion movement. They acknowledge that from the moment of conception, you have a human being. That's no longer in doubt, medically or scientifically. However, they don't believe that all human beings have the same rights. And so we a direct contradiction of the Declaration of Independence. But God has given us inalienable rights of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. I mean, this was so biblically based that even our founding fathers could not live consistently with the truths that they themselves recognized. But with evolution, it's survival of the fittest. I've never heard an evolutionist argue that all men have evolved equally. Now, they're always fighting for equal rights, and I'm glad that they will try to, at least to some extent, fight for equal rights, but that's just borrowed capital from the Christian worldview. There's nothing in the evolutionary worldview that would produce the God-given inalienable rights that are spelled out in the Declaration of Independence and that are biblically based. So what does this do, this survival of the fittest mentality? What does this do to our inalienable rights of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness? Well, we're going to see from some of the statements of leading evolutionists themselves who have told us what this does. Some excellent books that show the link between evolution and genocide, and the link between evolution and the slaughter of multitudes of innocent people. Richard Weikart, his work From Darwin to Hitler. Hitler is kind of a weird kind of guy. He combined a New Age pantheism, kind of a belief that the Aryan race was divine. So he had this neo-pagan belief system that he blended with evolutionary thought to justify the millions that he slaughtered. 10 Books That Screwed Up the World by Benjamin Weicker really gives you an overview of people who really, you know, they're looked upon as being heroes by our politically correct media, yet it's their ideas that led to things and continues to lead to things like the Holocaust. And then Wesley J. Smith of the Discovery Institute, based out of Seattle, his Consumer's Guide to a Brave New World. That book freaked me out. I did not know how advanced mankind was getting in his depravity, but we'll get to that a little bit later. So first, let's go to Charles Darwin, who wrote his work, The Origin of Species. Darwin argued, it was published in 1859. He argued for a naturalistic explanation for the origin of life and new life forms. So he was saying, we don't have to refer to miracles anymore or the supernatural. We've grown up intellectually and scientifically, so we don't need to talk about these fairy tales anymore. We can explain how everything got here just by looking at the way things operate. By the way, that's really lousy reasoning right from the start. That would be like looking at, having never seen a car before, and you see a car and it's running, and as you try to figure out how it runs, you then conclude, okay, that's how it got here. And see, the origin of the car and the operation of the car are two totally different things. And that's the way it is with science. There's operation science, which deals with the repeatable processes that are continuing right now, and origin singularities that occurred in the past, the origin of something. But whatever the case, that's what Darwin set out to do. And so he tried to explain our origins without reference to God. He rejected all supernatural causes and only accepted natural causes. Now you could read the pages of his life and his letters and see that he started out with being raised in a Christian home, and then at least he kind of went from theism, a belief in a personal God, to deism, to where God doesn't perform miracles, and then he kind of evolved eventually into an agnostic or an atheistic position in his thought. But whatever the case, his Origin of Species in 1859 was an attempt to provide an alternative naturalistic explanation. By the way, there were many evolutionists and many atheists already who were scientists a generation or two before this. What Darwin is credited as doing was giving his colleagues some kind of intellectual credibility and some type of scientific argumentation for what these guys already believed. And evolution, by the way, is not new. Ancient Greek philosophers, the Milesian school, held to evolutionary ideas, and that goes back to about 500 years before Jesus was born. Now, a lot of people don't talk, everybody talks about the origin of species, but they don't talk about Charles Darwin's 1871 work called The Descent of Man, where he started to apply his evolutionary theory to man. Well, what does that mean for human beings? So in this work, Darwin attempted to apply his evolutionary theories to moral issues. Now that evolution is true, Darwin asks, how should man now live? And so here's a few quotes from Darwin. He says, man, like every other animal, right off the bat, it doesn't sound like Christianity anymore. Man, like every other animal, has no doubt advanced to his present high condition through a struggle for existence consequent on his rapid multiplication. There should be open competition for all men, and the most able should not be prevented by laws or customs from succeeding best and rearing the largest number of offspring. Now, that's pretty fancy talk. What it basically seems to me is that if a guy's bigger and stronger than you, he should be able to get as many ladies as he wants and make as many babies as he wants, and that's all part of evolution. And if it applies for the animal kingdom, it ought to apply to us. Now, when's the last time you heard somebody quoting that from Darwin? He says, but excepting in the case of man himself, hardly anyone is so ignorant as to allow his worst animals to breed. So he's basically saying, I think there's some humans, I look around, I see some humans, I don't think we should allow them to breed and multiply and produce offspring. This makes most of the races that we have seen throughout history look like minor league stuff. Darwin said, at some future time, not very distant as measured by centuries, the civilized races of man will almost certainly exterminate and replace throughout the world the savage races. So he's saying it's inevitable. It's not right or wrong. We need to start throwing categories like that out. Eventually, the more evolved races are going to weed out and replace the savage races. By the way, when you see this evolutionary racism early in the history of the Darwinian evolution movement, you'll always find that wherever the guy is from, those are the people who are the most evolved. So if they're from Great Britain, like Darwin, they're the most evolved. If you go to Haeckel in Germany, they're the most evolved. And So everybody's looking in the mirror and saying, yeah, I'm it. I got the whole package. So Darwin's views, weaker members should not be allowed to reproduce. By the way, this agenda is being carried out and has been carried out and formed the foundation of an organization that we call Planned Parenthood. And it just amazes me when you look into the founding of Planned Parenthood by Margaret Sanger and the things that she says, has said. It just amazes me that you could actually get elected and speak highly of Planned Parenthood. But that's how far we've fallen. Darwin also argued that natural selection teaches that the most able of a species should reproduce at a quicker rate than weaker members, and he argued that white Europeans are superior to primitive tribal peoples. And again, there's that kind of worship of one's own culture, which you're going to see with a lot of these guys. Now, Darwin had a cousin, Francis Galton. By the way, there's a reason why they like to show off their bald heads and get their pictures taken without their hats on. Every once in a while you'll find a picture of Darwin with his hat on, but in early evolutionary science, they really thought that the size of your head determined your capability for attaining knowledge. So, and I know I got an amen over there from, and so it's really, really weird. But these guys, there was so much superstition and fairy tale involved with early evolutionary thought. In fact, I think evolution itself is a fairy tale. But Darwin's cousin actually founded the modern eugenics movement. I think Darwin was reluctant to say, okay, well, if evolution is true, what does that mean in our dealings with other human beings? Darwin was reluctant because of his Christian upbringing, and he didn't, even in his Descent of Man, you'll find Darwin stating these things, and then all of a sudden he'll kind of pull back a little bit and say that it kind of bothers him, okay? But once Francis Galton started getting the credit for popularizing the view of eugenics, which means good genes or good birth, Darwin had to jump into the competition. He had to come out and start publishing stuff. But Francis Galton got his idea about eugenics from reading Darwin's Origin of Species. He wrote his Hereditary Genius in 1869, so it was 2 years before Darwin wrote The Descent of Man, and there he introduced the term eugenics before Darwin wrote about it. He introduced the term even before Darwin wrote about it in 1865 in another work. But whatever the case, he argues Galton did, and then Darwin did after him, that natural selection, one of the views of evolutionary science, natural selection demands eugenics. Herbert Spencer, after Darwin wrote his Origin of Species, Spencer removed God from his ethical theory. So Spencer is recognizing, wait a minute, if we take God out of the creation business, then we got to take God also out of the morality business. We got to try to come up with a morality that isn't based on belief in God. What Spencer is recognizing is what Friedrich Nietzsche said, the German philosopher, the atheist, who said, if God is dead, if God is dead, then truth is dead, morality is dead, meaning is dead. Nietzsche understood. If you ever get a chance, read his madman parable. Nietzsche's the madman in the early dawn with the lantern. He comes too early, and he's upset with his atheist colleagues because they think God is dead, now it's business as usual. Nietzsche's freaking out. He's saying if God is dead, everything changes. We've detached the earth from its sun. There's no longer any up or down anymore. Everything is up for grabs. Everything changes. And so Spencer realized that it was time to build a new ethical theory on evolutionary thought. We just can't continue with Christian morality if the Christian God has been removed from the equation. Ernst Haeckel out of Germany, 19th century Darwinist, he believed Darwinian thought ruled out human free will, and that morality is also evolving and not fixed. By the way, it was amazing how many things we applied evolution to everything, gradual change to everything, so that even Oliver Wendell Holmes, United States Supreme Court Justice, said that everything is evolving, including the Constitution. And the guys on the Supreme Court will tell you exactly what it means right now. We'll decide what it means right now, but it's not going to mean that same thing 10 years from now because it's evolving with everything else. Well, Haeckel realized that morality, if everything's evolving, then so is morality. It's not anchored. There's no moral absolutes, things that are wrong for all people at all times and all places. If there's no transcendent God, there's no transcendent morality. And so natural selection was the driving force for morality, according to Haeckel. And then Nietzsche, I talked about him just a little. Philosopher who embraced atheistic evolution. He said God is dead. He didn't believe God was alive and then God had a heart attack and died. He believed that science had refuted the Christian myth. So that when he said God is dead, he's saying Christianity is dead. He's saying Christianity is no longer, the Christian worldview is no longer the driving force of Western civilization. It's not the thing that we turn to derive our morality and meaning in life and find truth. And so he said, well, if God is dead, truth and traditional morality have died with him. He also rejected the soft values of Christianity like mercy and grace and charity. He believed that was holding back human creativity and human evolution. So he wanted to see human beings turn to hard values where you have a group of supermen or overmen with the courage to create their own new myth, to create their own new truth, to create their own new morality. And then they're going to force this down everybody else's throats with a vengeance. And so he glorified things like war and sexual freedom and things of that sort. But he believed Christianity was good for its time, but now we need the next stage of man's spiritual as well as physical evolution, and that was going to take the promotion of hard values by a group of supermen. He rejected Darwin's view of natural selection and survival of the fittest. Nietzsche's will, there's a lot of people that will try to say all the hundreds of millions of people who were slaughtered by big atheistic governments and the neo-pagan government of the Nazis. You can't blame Nietzsche for that because he really didn't accept Darwinian evolution. Well, yeah, he didn't accept Darwinian evolution because he actually thought Darwinian evolution was too soft. It wasn't hard enough. So Nietzsche's will to power, when truth and morality are gone, all that's left is man's lust for power, man's will to power. And he saw that as a good thing because, again, he's deriving his morality, like Haeckel said, from natural selection and survival of the fittest. So the fact that some guys want to dominate other guys is not a bad thing. That's just the way life is. Evolution is a bloody thing. And so his will to power is even more aggressive than Darwin's will to survive. So with Darwin, the strong compete with the weak for survival. With Nietzsche, the strong aggressively dominate the weak. So it's dominance. It's not survival. It's not like, we're all going for the same piece of meat, and I want to survive, so you might not survive, but the stronger ones are going to get it. No, it's like you actively seek to dominate the weak. And these were the hard values of Nietzsche. Lenin, Vladimir, I can't even pronounce his middle name, but there's Lenin, the old Soviet dictator. and also Joseph Stalin, the Soviet Union dictator. They were Marxist atheists who embraced Darwinian evolution. They rejected absolute morality and promoted revolution to bring about. Eventually, the goal was supposed to be a classless communist society, but in the meantime, you got to establish the dictatorship of the proletariat, the dictatorship of the working class. And since the entire working class can't rule, the professional revolutionaries say, well, okay, well, we'll rule for you. And so you end up with these cold-blooded murderers become the dictators in the dictatorship of the proletariat. But whatever the case, Lenin and Stalin slaughtered well over 20 million people in the Soviet Union. In fact, I think that number is actually pretty low. Dr. R.J. Rumble at the University of Hawaii, he coined the phrase democide, death by government. And he showed that in the 20th century alone, from 1917, the start of the Soviet Union, until 1991, the collapse of the Soviet Union, big governments killed between 170 million and 320 million of their own people during peacetime. Now that's more than all the people that have been killed in mankind's wars put together. Okay, so I don't like when our own government lies to us. Our own government wants us to think terrorism is the biggest threat, and so now we got to give up a whole lot of freedom to make us safe from the terrorist. In reality, war kills a lot more people than terrorism does. Like for instance, the war on terror, whether you're for it or against it, there's a lot more people who've died there than in any terrorist acts that America has experienced. So war is a bigger threat. But the fact of the matter is, big government during peacetime kills more of its own innocent people than wars do. So the number one thing we ought to fear is not some terrorists from other countries. It's not even wars. The number one thing we ought to fear, as far as in this world, should be our own leaders. And that's why Ben Franklin said that any people who are willing to give up liberty for security deserve neither. And but whatever the case, again, you have evolution being applied to government and dealing with humans, and it leads to slaughter. Chinese communism, based on atheistic evolution and survival of the fittest mentality, responsible for up to at least 65 million deaths in China. Steve Cortuz's book, Black Book of Communism, it's got atheistic communism throughout the world may have murdered close to 100 million people in the 20th century, and his numbers are very, very conservative. R.J. Rummel's probably closer to the truth on that, but he would also add the neo-pagan Nazis to the list and the tens of millions that they killed, as well as Islamic regimes that have slaughtered innocent people as well. So it's really interesting, and I think Darwinian evolution plays a big role in this, but the 20th century, if it has done anything, it has shown us that the most efficient killing machine in the history of mankind is big government. The number one serial murderer of all kind is big government. Yet we come out of the 20th century with all this evidence for the dangers of big government, and we come out, this is the closest we've been to the deification of the state, to worshiping the state in the history of Western civilization, going back to ancient Rome. And so the future looks rather bleak if we don't have widespread revival in this country and return to the God who blessed us so abundantly in the past. Of course, Adolf Hitler, he embraced Darwinian evolution. If you read his Mein Kampf, he talks about that. That means my struggle. He wrote that from prison. He was one of the leaders of a failed revolution attempt, and ended up going to prison for it. But Hitler embraced Darwinian evolution, but he also believed in a weird German pagan. He wanted to get back to the ancient pagan myths. And the Nazis grew out of the Thule Society, which is just, the Thule Society is the German branch of the Theosophical Society founded by Helena Blavatsky, which is basically, the late Dr. Walter Martin called the Theosophical Society the forerunner of the New Age movement that we see today. But basically, he believed the Aryan race was the master race and that non-Aryans were subhumans. He wanted to exterminate non-Aryans so that they would not pollute the pure bloodline of the master race. And so he accepted Darwinian eugenic theories. They had clinics where they would take disabled people and the people would leave in ashes. They would execute them and either lethal injection or through gas, then cremate the bodies and then send them out the back door. But whatever the case, I mean, this is repeating itself today. A good book you might want to look into, it's probably out of print like most good books, but it's authored by Richard Terrell, a philosophy professor, and it's called Resurrecting the Third Reich. Resurrecting the Third Reich, where he's actually arguing that the Third Reich is making a comeback through the New Age movement. The only differences are it's not based on bloodline, now it's based on ideology. So if you're not ready to embrace the belief that man is God, and you're not ready to worship yourself and to worship the planet, then you're going to get in the way. You need to be exterminated. But the new age is going to be a new age of peace and righteousness when man worships himself and the planet. And so Richard Terrell is arguing that there's going to be another Holocaust, but it's going to be on a global scale, and there's not going to be any allies to turn to, because this is going to go across boundaries. By the way, Christians are being defined into an intolerant, bigoted group that is not ready for the so-called New Age or New World Order. And we've got to remind ourselves, the early Christians, the number one crime they were convicted of was being haters of mankind. And these were peaceful, loving people, but they refused to say Caesar is Lord. Instead, they said Jesus is Lord. And Rome said, well, we gave you peace. You're opposed to the peace of Rome, the Pax Romanus. We knocked off your regime. We set up puppet rulers. Least you could do is pay us taxes and worship Caesar. And the Christians said no, and so they said, okay, well, these guys are meeting in secret. Of course they're meeting in secret. You're trying to arrest them. They're meeting in secret. They're conspiring against the state. They're haters of mankind. They're opposed to the peace of Rome. And so we Christians need to be aware of how the world views us. And at the very least, what we need to do is show the world that they're being very inconsistent when they proclaim to be tolerant. In the name of tolerance, they can't tolerate us because we don't agree with them. Toleration means you tolerate people that you disagree with. Yet, the new traditional tolerance was freedom of religion, freedom of speech. The new tolerance is all beliefs are equally true, all behaviors equally wholesome. Oh, by the way, if you disagree with us, we can't tolerate you. So the new tolerance is intolerant to the highest level. Hitler's views led to the slaughter of 6 million Jews. He may have murdered up to 20 million people total. Margaret Sanger, she died in 1966. She was the founder of Planned Parenthood. She wrote The Pivot of Civilization in 1922. She called for the immediate sterilization of feeble-minded people. She was the foremost leader of the eugenics, the good genes movement in America. She wanted to sterilize everybody that didn't fit into, she had her own white Aryan, white European views of superiority, and wanted to sterilize any groups of people that didn't fit into that category. Now, Planned Parenthood was forced to tone down its rhetoric once the Nazi atrocities became known. Now, this latest abortion doctor that was, killing babies in cold blood, even after they were born, if the abortion failed. We're starting to find there's more and more guys like that. But I'll be totally honest with you. I think he's more, his practice is more consistent with what Planned Parenthood is all about. And but basically, if you can kill human beings before they're born, why can't you kill human beings after they're born? And we'll see when we get to Peter Singer, where the cutting edge of the pro-abortion philosophical thought has led to. Margaret Sanger promoted sexual promiscuity, birth control, sterilization. She was doing this in the 1920s and the 1930s. Sterilization for impoverished people, mainly non-whites. She promoted abortion and euthanasia. She stated the most merciful thing a large family can do to one of its infant members is to kill it. Hitler had a phrase for non-Aryans. He called them, and for disabled people, he called them useless eaters. And what he meant was they were eating food that could nourish the perfect Aryan race. And her way of thinking wasn't much different than that. Poverty is a big problem. A good way to solve it would be to sterilize poor people so they don't reproduce. And she thought people were poor because of their genetic makeup. They didn't have the good genes. It had nothing to do with lack of opportunity or the fact that most of the groups she was targeting were the newest immigrant groups to America, plus the black Americans who not too long before had been enslaved. And I mean, it's pretty hard to work your way up from that. And so she took that as just evidence for a racist, Darwinian type of ideology. From 1907 to the early 1970s, to about 1973, nearly 70,000 Americans have been forced to have legally sanctioned sterilization operations. In fact, I can't remember if it was the Clinton administration. They nominated some guy to hold some high position, and they found out that this guy had conducted 4 sterilizations before 1973, and so obviously he had to drop out. But let me say this, if terrorists come here and mess with us, and the terrorists are part of a government like the Taliban was, then I'm all for chasing them clear around the world, getting them and bringing justice to them. But then I think we ought to get our troops out as quick as possible after the job is done. At the same time, the idea that it's our government's job to police the earth and that it's our government's job to kill all the bad guys, all the monsters out there. John Quincy Adams said, America does not seek monsters abroad to destroy lest we lose freedom within our borders. So John Quincy Adams, one of our former presidents, understood that's not what America's about. We're not supposed to go around the world. But I will tell you this, that we Christians sometimes, we still think that we have the moral high ground. And I'll just ask you this and then I'll move on. How many unborn babies do we have to kill before we're as bad as the thugs that we're going out to get? The numbers are, it's well over 50 million babies that we've killed before they were born. And I think we've lost the moral high ground. I think we need to worry about cleaning up our own government and cleaning up our own culture, and instead of acting like we're perfect and we need to make the rest of the world like us. And I think there's some real detriments to living in a state of perpetual war, which is what we've been doing for over a century now. B.F. Skinner, he's one of the leaders of behavioral science, behavioral psychology. And Skinner, in his work Beyond Freedom and Human Dignity, he argued that due to atheistic evolution, we need to acknowledge that man is not free. He is biologically determined. So he doesn't believe in a human soul. He doesn't believe in free will. So he doesn't believe we make choices. Now, I'm a little bit under the weather right now, okay? But nobody's going to say, well, come on, Fernandes, why did you decide to catch a cold? I didn't decide to catch a cold. I just caught it, okay? It was biologically determined. But if B.F. Skinner's right, if atheism is true, if consistent evolutionary thought is true, then man is his body. And so I might choose to do something, but I didn't really choose to do it. It was biologically determined. And so Skinner says we need to get beyond concepts like freedom and human dignity. God doesn't exist. Man is not free. We don't make choices. Human life is not sacred. And so he said we need to acknowledge, due to atheistic evolution, that man is not free. He's biologically determined. His actions are the product of his environment and his genes. Okay? And so the intellectual elite, this is what Skinner said, the intellectual elite need to control man genetically and environmentally to bring about the best future. Now, let me see if okay, let me address that. Francis Schaeffer wrote a book, little tiny book, called Back to Freedom and Human Dignity in the 1970s, where it was a smackdown. He just totally refuted Skinner's view. See, he said, look, what he basically said was that the Christian thinker Schaeffer, if Skinner is correct, then the intellectual elite are really not any smarter than the masses. I mean, there's no absolute truth. So how could they know more truth and know that truth more deeply than anybody else if there really is no truth? So Schaeffer, first off, says, I'm not too sure your intellectual elite are so intellectual or elite. And then he says, now wait a minute, too, if man is controlled genetically, okay, and by his environment, then that would also apply to B.F. Skinner's intellectual elite. So they didn't even make these choices. They're controlled just like we are. And then he wants to bring about the best future. Schaeffer says, well, if there's no such thing as good and evil, what does best mean? I mean, if the whole world blows up 2 weeks from now, if there's no such thing as good and evil, that's not any worse than if the world thrived for 10,000 more years. So this is contradictory throughout, but this is what you get when you try to apply the atheistic evolutionary worldview to morality and society. Watson and Crick, James Watson and Francis Crick, they won the Nobel Prize for discovering the DNA double helix. A lot of people don't know this, but they believe in infanticide of disabled babies up to 3 days old. This was in the early 1970s when these guys were accepting their Nobel Prize award. They were saying that what we should do is for 3 days after a baby is born, let the parents and the doctors watch it closely to decide whether or not they want to terminate that baby's life. And so they're basically saying, look, we know that human life starts at conception, so we know that they're pro-abortion, they're all for killing babies before they're born, and they say, well, we just arbitrarily say at birth it becomes a human being. Why not say, well, maybe 3 days later it becomes a human being? So you have to keep in mind, Planned Parenthood will argue that the unborn baby is tissue, but everybody knows that's not the case. On the intellectual level, they acknowledge abortion is killing human beings who haven't been born yet. And so this debate is actually occurring on a whole different level. And by the way, whenever somebody kills a pregnant lady and the baby dies too, we usually charge them with two counts of homicide. In fact, in the state I'm from, when I used to be in law enforcement, The Revised Code of Washington said that Title IX in the Revised Code of Washington, if a woman performs her own abortion, she can be charged with manslaughter. Well, the Revised Code of Washington defines manslaughter as one type of homicide, and it defines homicide as the murder of a human being. So when a lady performs her own abortion, it's a human being and she's guilty of murder. But when a state-sponsored executioner kills a baby before it's born, it's not really a baby. It's just tissue. And so Watson and Crick promote genetic engineering, such as cloning, to try to produce perfect humans. Peter Singer, he's a Princeton ethicist, and he's an evolutionist. He believes human life starts at conception. When you read his works like Practical Ethics, he comes right out and says, yeah, it's impossible to refute the pro-lifers when they say that human life starts at conception. See, because, you know, when the egg and the sperm join, you have a new life. And if the parents are human, then the new life is human. That's just biology. And so he says, well, we're killing human beings before they're born, and since we don't believe in God anymore, I'm okay with that, but we're being inconsistent when we say we can't kill babies after they're born. So he took the 3-day period of Watson and Crick, and he extended that to about 14 days. His colleagues said he wasn't being consistent with his views by drawing the line at 14 days, so then he extended it to a month or two, okay? So in his book, Practical Ethics, he promotes abortion, infanticide, which is the killing of babies already born, and euthanasia of humans who do not achieve personhood, which is a certain level of consciousness. So now the debate on the scholarly level is not about is the unborn or the patient human. The debate is about, they acknowledge the unborn baby's human, the disabled person is human. The debate is about, has this human achieved a level of consciousness to where we would say, yes, that this human has personhood, okay? And he believes that the life of a newborn human baby is not worth as much as the life of a full-grown pig, dog, or chimpanzee, because the newborn baby does not have the same level of consciousness, okay? He by the way, he's the father of the animal rights movement as well. So what you find with Darwinian evolution, as animal rights are on the rise, human rights are going down the tubes. Here's one of his quotes. You got to read his stuff closely. But by the way, I'll read his quotes to my students when I teach an ethics course to high schoolers at CrossPoint Academy in Bremerton, Washington. I'll read his quotes, but I'll read quotes from him showing that every other page this guy is saying. Now keep in mind, I'm not saying the same thing the Nazis said. And then he'll draw a distinction between what the Nazis were saying and what he's saying. And so I said, what would you think, as my students, if every 10 minutes I had to remind you that my views were not identical with Hitler and the Nazis? And eventually one of the students figures it out. They'd say, all right, well, I think that your views must be so close that you're not sure if we draw the distinction, so you have to make it for us. And I said, bingo, that's what it's about. It's not a coincidence that when this guy gets protested, there are a lot of people, more than half the people are usually in wheelchairs protesting him. But he says, I have argued that the life of a fetus, and even more plainly of an embryo, is of no greater value than the life of a non-human animal at a similar level of rationality, self-consciousness, awareness, capacity to feel, etc. And since no fetus is a person, no fetus has the same claim to life as a person. Now, it must be admitted that these arguments apply to the newborn baby as much as to the fetus. and the life of a newborn baby is of less value to it than the life of a pig, a dog, or a chimpanzee is to the non-human animal. Now, this is really weird, but what he's talking about is that if a baby hasn't achieved a certain level of consciousness, then it doesn't hold its own life as being valuable because it doesn't really know much about anything. And so he's saying at that point, the human life would be worth less than the life of an adult pig, dog, or chimpanzee, which does value its life because it's achieved that level of consciousness. See, what he's doing, Singer, it seems like he took his marching orders from Nietzsche. Because he's saying, look, if God doesn't exist, why do we still promote Christian morality? And a lot of his colleagues will say, well, we don't. We have abortion now. And he'd say, yeah, but why stop at abortion? If Darwinian evolution is true and God doesn't exist, then we could use the same arguments that legalized abortion to legalize the killing of babies already born that we don't want, and to exterminate people like Terry Schiavo. Terry Schiavo wasn't even dying. And a judge ruled that they could starve her to death. Her parents fought it. Her parents were actually, they would get patted down before they went to visit her to make sure they weren't sneaking her food. And I think it took her about 14 to 17 days to die. Joseph Fletcher, he's famous for situational ethics. Another former Princeton professor. He promoted government action to force eugenics on the weak. That would be, sterilizing those you don't want to reproduce and all. And he wanted to set a legal minimal standard for allowing humans to reproduce. So if they didn't fit Joseph Fletcher's standard, see what you have is when God is removed from the equation, inevitably man will play God. The decisions you see Peter Singer making and Joseph Fletcher making, those are decisions, of life and death. Those are the decisions God's supposed to make. But if there is no God, somebody's got to play God. Somebody's got to call the shots. And so that's what Fletcher wants to do. He promoted genetic engineering, cloning, and animal-human hybrids to achieve the goal of producing superior people. He even called for human-animal chimeras, hybrids basically, to be some sort of slave labor. By the way, at Ivy League schools in their bioethicist departments, the debate is not should we have animal-human hybrids. The debate is when we have them, should they be the master race and we serve them, we become their slaves, or should we try to produce them in such a way that they could be our slaves and can you imagine just having a military of 1 million lion human hybrids, and then your guys don't have to go to battle and stuff like that? At the same time, why not give them a certain level of intelligence where they're the masters and we're the slaves? Now, I thought this was all sci-fi until I read J. Wesley Smith's works on this. And then one day I was watching the news, and our television news, we like to report things as news that aren't really important. And so sometimes you got to surf the internet to try to find out what the real news is. And the problem there is, as the pastor spoke in the first message, you don't always know what's coming from a good source, what's a good source, and what's a bogus source. I mean, if Joe Schmo the idiot has a lot nicer website than Mr. Brilliant, who's done his research, you might be tempted to accept this guy's views. And but whatever the case, I was watching the CNN, and there was some movie star in a scandal or something. So it was something stupid. So I was like, okay, well, that's not the real news. Let me see if there's any real news down at the bottom of the screen, the words coming across the screen. And this was probably about 10 years ago. They said that in Great Britain, Parliament had legalized harvesting stem cells from frozen animal-human hybrid embryos. And I was like, I didn't even know we had frozen animal-human hybrid embryos, but apparently we do. So apparently we've experimented to that point, but nobody wants to thaw them out, because what if the thing turns out to be human enough to want to sue the doctor who brought it into existence? You could be, these scientists would be going bankrupt. So they just keep these things frozen. But I'm just like, man, I'm thinking like Brave New World, 50 years from now. It's like, man, some aspects of it are here already. And then there's Richard Dawkins. And Richard Dawkins equates believing in God. He says that's like believing in the flying spaghetti monster. Well, I don't think he really believes that, because he actually resigned from Oxford. He doesn't even have to teach at Oxford, because he makes so much money writing books slamming God and debating people who believe in God throughout the world. He makes so much money doing that. I bet he has not made a dime writing refutations of the flying spaghetti monster, and I doubt anybody's ever given him a dime to debate somebody on a college campus over the existence of the flying spaghetti monster. So I think his analogy really stinks. But he's an evolutionary biologist who calls teaching children about God child abuse in the God Delusion, page 303. So, the thing is, these guys love to do that. They'll say, well, if you teach your children about God, you're abusing them. That's child abuse. You have to just let them grow up and then let them decide later on. But he won't say, therefore, we need to imprison Christians. He leaves that for the lawyers and the judges to worry about that. But it's pretty obvious Dawkins, like most people, would want to see child abusers behind bars. So, is he calling for closing churches, Christian schools, and imprisoning Christians, all in the name of tolerance? Probably. You use the words child abuse. I think we can see where that's leading. Now, how did this all come about? We don't have time to get into it, but Romans 1:18-32 addresses this issue. It talks about we have not seen the invisible God, but we see the visible work of his hands. So he's proven his existence to us through the visible creation, but mankind suppresses that truth. Now remember, you can't suppress a truth unless deep down inside you actually know it. So we suppress that truth, we reject God, and then that leads us to worship. If we don't worship the Creator, we'll ultimately worship the creation. That's idolatry. At best, Paul doesn't say you reject God and you become an atheist. He says you reject God, you become an idolater. At best, atheism is a halfway house between belief in God and idolatry and paganism. From there, they move on to gross immorality. Paul uses homosexuality as an example of it in this passage. Then that leads to widespread wickedness and violence. And then the final stage in the devolution and the decay and the decline of a culture is the promotion of evil, where you not only do evil, but you promote it. You come up with like new absolutes. And the new tolerance, well, we've talked about already, and that's what you know what you could call a promotion of evil in America. You can call it political correctness, where there's no debate. They just laugh at you or they scream at you if you say that you're against a woman's so-called right to have an abortion. A good book there is William Watkins on the New Absolutes. He shows what the old moral absolutes were and now what the new absolutes are. That Christian morality has been replaced by evolutionary pagan immorality. This is what Isaiah said when the Jews were about to be judged. Woe to those who call good evil and evil good. Right now, homosexuality is viewed as a very healthy lifestyle. Yet, if you're a Christian, you're a bigot. I mean, just look at, I don't know if you've seen how our government right now views Christians in the military. But they're basically calling for disciplinary action to be taken on anybody who tries to proselytize, anybody who tries to share their faith with another. Even the chaplains now are not even supposed to try to lead people to Christ. So woe to those who call good evil and evil good. Okay, what am I doing wrong? We talked about this, The New Tolerance, good book, Josh McDowell and Bob Hostetler. The traditional tolerance said freedom of speech, freedom of religion. The new tolerance says all beliefs are equally true, all behavior is equally wholesome. Oh, by the way, if you disagree with us, we can't tolerate you. Well, that means the new tolerance is actually intolerant, because tolerance is when you tolerate people who disagree with you. And that's not going on right now. Let me say this too. Often Christians, we're often trying to win a debate that was lost 20 years ago or 30 years ago. And so we used to have God's absolutes, God's moral absolutes when this country was founded. Then we moved to a point where there was no moral absolutes, moral relativism. We said what's right for you is right for you, doesn't have to be right for me, and vice versa. Those days are gone. When we lived in the days of moral relativism and no absolutes, your neighbor would say, well, I'm not a Christian, but if that's good for you, more power to you. I'm happy that you're happy. But see, now we live in an age of new absolutes, where the old absolutes are now if you're a Bible-believing Christian, you're viewed as an intolerant bigot. But if you're a sexually immoral person in certain contexts, you're to be praised. That's a wholesome lifestyle, something to be proud of. Now, in my book, God, Government, the Road to Tyranny, I wrote a chapter on the death of Western civilization. Originally, it was a paper I presented at a regional meeting of the Evangelical Theological Society at Multnomah School of the Bible in Portland, Oregon, in 1998, where I showed where Nietzsche said, if God is dead, then truth, morality, and meaning are dead as well, but this will produce the Superman. Well, that doesn't make sense. C.S. Lewis, in his The Abolition of Man, which he wrote in the 1940s, Francis Schaeffer, in his Back to Freedom and Human Dignity, used the phrase, the death of man. What Schaeffer and Lewis, being Christians, understood is that they said, well, wait a minute, without even mentioning Nietzsche, by the way. But they realized if God is dead, man is dead too. And so you could title this whole talk that I've been giving about social Darwinism as the death of man. By the way, this is Peter Singer. His mother, I don't know if she's still alive, but she had Alzheimer's. So by his own thinking, he could have her killed if he wanted to. He wants that to be legal. Yet, he loved his mother and took care of her. And that's not inconsistent with his thought, because in his thought, he, being a person who's achieved a certain level of personhood, could vest in her his value. An example of that would be is if Dave came up and said, Phil, I really want to apologize to you. I had a bad day the other day. I was driving around your neighborhood and I killed a dog. I was driving my car, hit a dog and killed a dog, and I was speeding. It was my fault. I'd say, hey, things like that happen, man. I really feel bad about you, but don't worry about it, man. It's not a big deal. But then he says, oh yeah, there's one more thing. It was your dog. Okay, now my response is going to be different. Why? My dog's got no more value than other dogs except to me and to my wife. And see, that's what Peter Singer is doing. He's devalued people who don't fit into that kind of master race. Yet, if someone who does fit there is willing to take care of them and vest in them their value, then they're free to take care of them and all. And so, it just gets down to you remove God, the perfect God, and now you got Peter Singer and Joseph Fletcher's idea of the perfect human, and they're going to determine who lives and who dies. But Schaeffer and C.S. Lewis got it right. If God is dead, man is dead as well. Thanks to Darwinian evolution, a world without God has produced sexual promiscuity both among heterosexuals and homosexuals, a loss of respect for human life and rights. Abortion killed over 50 million. Infanticide, now we see that it goes on. By the way, we've had court-ordered infanticide since at least the early 1980s. And then even euthanasia. Wesley J. Smith points out in one of his works that since the 1990s, judges, no change in laws at all, judges have given permission to take people off of life support and to kill people who many times could have easily been cured, or in some cases the people were not dying and they withheld intravenous feeding from them. But abortion, infanticide, euthanasia, genocide and democide that we saw in countries like the old Soviet Union and Red China and Nazi Germany. The possible future, now we're talking about playing God and cloning humans. We're talking about genetic engineering, designer babies. We could probably figure out a way to make babies that would perform like our favorite athletes if we just genetically engineer them to the right regard. Possible future, master race, animal-human hybrids. The list goes on and on. Suddenly, science fiction becomes a real possibility. And so now, if I'm correct, we still have time for questions. Okay, so I'm just going to wrap it up there, and then if we have any questions that you'd like to ask or any comments you'd like to make. Yes?
Do you think that, just the devaluing of all morality is a worldwide thing, or do you think it's more of, it's happening in this country, but it's reversing in a different country?
Okay, yeah, her question was, is it a worldwide thing, and or is it just happening like in this country? Basically, I'm dealing with Western civilization, which had been Christianized to a very significant degree. So I'm talking about Europe and America. And Germany usually leads the way in thought. They're usually 40 years ahead of Europe, and Europe is usually 40 years ahead of us. If you want to see where we're going to be in 40 years, talk to professors at Ivy League schools in America. And but basically, Europe has already had their slide, their collapse, spiritually speaking. Nietzsche, when he closes the madman parable, he's arguing with his atheist colleagues, but at the end he says, what have become of the churches? What have the churches become but sepulchres of a dead God? And so basically Nietzsche predicted that the churches throughout Europe were going to be museums. People don't really worship God there anymore. That's all outdated and that's pre-scientific. And so I'm talking about mainly Europe and America, and Europe's way further down the slide than we are, because we had the Christian worldview. Now, having said that, well, what about the rest of the world? It depends where you're looking at, but if atheistic communists are reigning, they've already devalued human life. So a place like Red China, they're already there. And now they want to make some money, so they're bringing a little bit of freedom into their economic theory. But the fact of the matter is, they treat people. I mean, they've had the one child per family policy, and they enforce that as best as they can. So they'll force abortions and things of that sort. There's a lot of infanticide going on. and euthanizing of girls that are no longer wanted by their families because now they have a baby boy, and that's going to be their one child. The good thing is, though, in African countries and many of the Asian countries and Central and South American countries, Christianity is growing at such, biblical Christianity is growing at such a fast rate that there is genuine revival that probably the greatest revival in the history of Christianity since the book of Acts is occurring right now. Now, having said that, the dynamics are a little different in that in places where people have political say, political power, whether they're constitutional republics or so-called democracies, that's where Christianity is in decline. In places where Christianity is on the rise, these people have no political freedom. So they're very likely to be martyred or to be persecuted or to at least lose their jobs. So basically what I'm saying is that even though Christianity is alive and well on the planet Earth, and it is growing and we're experiencing revival like never before, it's not translating into more political power for the Christian worldview. And so, and I'm a premillennialist. I believe Jesus will literally reign on earth, return and reign on earth for 1,000 years. So I do believe in a tribulation period that will precede the second coming of Christ. And I think it's very likely that what we're seeing, the scenario that we're seeing, could really fit well into the end time scenario. But it's a very good question. But this is mainly in the West. But the West has been a tremendous restraining influence on evil throughout the world. Another aspect to bring up is Islamic fundamentalism in the Middle East and what that does to the sanctity of human life. I mean, your rights are protected if you're a Muslim. If you're not a Muslim, you have no rights. So, somebody else had their hand up?
Dr. Fernandes?
Yeah.
If and to what extent have you seen this permeate the church?
Well, yeah, the question was if I've seen this permeate the church, and if so, to what extent. The Protestant denominations, the mainline denominations, large chunks of the mainline denominations have bought on to evolutionary thinking, so they still hold to belief in God, but he's more of a powerless God, a God that doesn't intervene. And so they're jumping on the bandwagon with political correctness and all. So those are the mainline churches. Now, having said that, when you hear that the Evangelical Lutheran Church of America voted to ordain homosexuals, what most Baptists like myself think is that the whole Lutheran Church has apostatized. No, you've got the Missouri Synod that could care less what the ELCA does. They're about as concerned. They disagree with Baptists on Baptist Lutheran things, but they're holding true. The Wisconsin Synod is even more conservative than them, so conservative it scares me. There's been a new Lutheran denomination started by ELCA people that have left called the North American Lutheran Synod. So there are there's a remnant in the mainline denominations that are really fighting and taking a stand. But for the most part, it's very common to find Methodist churches, many Presbyterian churches, many Lutheran churches that no longer preach the truth, and they're actually going New Age in their thought. Now, the evangelical church, the church that claims to believe the Bible, there's a lot of things for us to cause concern. I wouldn't see it as totally jumping on the bandwagon. But sometimes we could get a survival of the fittest mentality and act like, we got to have the biggest church in town and we'll get it at any cost. And I'm all for building a church on the Word of God. And I praise God that some of our mega churches got to be mega churches by preaching the meat of the word and evangelizing and discipling people. But you could end up with a little survival of the fittest mentality that could come across with the church growth movement and trying to implement a lot of man's wisdom from sociology and psychology rather than just being obedient to the Great Commission. Also, the emergent church movement, postmodernism, is creeping into the church. And so there's actually guys who claim to be Bible-believing Christians that have such a low view on truth that Christianity just happens to be the narrative that their community chooses to embrace. So I would say it's not this particular Darwinian way of thinking hasn't really made gigantic inroads to the evangelical church, the Bible-believing church. But in the mainline denominations, they're pretty, whatever they are, they shouldn't really call themselves Christians anymore, is how far they've fallen. So, yes?
I'm really confused about the Catholic Church.
Mm-hmm.
Because we got both saying one thing, and then I know priests that co-opted, and then you got people who want all different directions. Some who read the Bible and are really into it, and others
Yeah.
good church from seminary.
Yeah, and so this lady, she said she's kind of confused about the Catholic Church because the Pope will say one thing, then bishops and cardinals will do something totally different, and then the individual Roman Catholics will do a lot of different stuff. And I would agree. I was raised Roman Catholic. I might be the only person here whose father was a Franciscan monk. He took 5 separate one-year vows before. And then they told him to take a vow for life. He said, well, he's not sure what God wants him to do. And they said, well, fine. Well, then just get out. You're in good standing. You could always come back. So he got out, fell in love with electricity. Then he fell in love with my mom, and then the rest is history. And so I was raised in Roman Catholicism, and technically the infallibility of the Pope is an issue when the Pope speaks ex cathedra, when he speaks from the chair of Peter for the entire church in areas of faith or practice. And but the fact of the matter is the Roman Catholic theologians have never fully defined when the Pope does and when he does not speak ex cathedra. So you'll even have leading Catholic theologians who are buddies with the Pope who may disagree about when a pronouncement has been made. Often, like many Baptists, if you had 100 Roman Catholics in the room, you might have 100 different views. And so we've got to, get to know the people. But basically, they're supposed to be taking their marching orders from not only the Scriptures, but church tradition, teachings of the church fathers, and the Pope is supposed to have the final say there. I myself think that the Scriptures clearly teach sola scriptura, that the Bible is the final authority. And my Catholic friends tell me no, because so many people disagree about what the Bible says. And so then when I turn around and tell them, yeah, but look at all the Catholics that disagree with each other, but they act like the church's teaching arm is some big thing that settles all these disputes, when in actuality, I've heard bishops and cardinals say things that if they were assistant pastors or pastors of a Baptist church, they'd get kicked out. And it's something where they clearly disagree with the Pope on, and the Pope does nothing. So you can claim papal infallibility all you want. If you don't enforce it, I don't really fully understand what it means there. Now, as far as the differences between Protestants and Catholics, there are many, although there's some Protestants like the Anglicans that are a lot closer to Catholics than they would be to Baptists. But the main difference is the true traditional Protestant says the Bible, God has spoken to us in His Word, so the Bible is the final authority for faith and practice. the Roman Catholic Church is supposed to say, well, it's the Bible plus church tradition. And since the church gave us the Bible in their view, the church the teaching arm of the church can only rightly interpret the scriptures. So in the end, it's the Bible plus church tradition, but church tradition swallows up the Bible, so that things that are clearly not taught in the scriptures, and sometimes even things that are clearly contradicted by the scriptures, are taught as truth by the teaching magisterium. So there's a lot of so the difference is like praying to Mary, praying to the saints, that all flows from their high view of church tradition, which I think even church tradition needs to be tested with the Word of God. So, yes, sir.
I did have another question, but just in response to this last question.
Yeah.
The Roman Catholic Church, I believe, has officially accepted evolution.
It's a tough one to call, but basically now, I believe it was John Paul, correct me if I'm wrong, I believe it was John Paul II, and he basically made a statement that evolutionary science is not inconsistent with Roman Catholic theology. Now, if I understand him correctly, he's not speaking ex cathedra and saying to be a good Catholic you have to embrace evolution, but what he's basically saying is you can be a fire-breathing evolutionist and still be a good Roman Catholic. And I knew that was coming because one of Thomas Aquinas' 5 ways to argue for God's existence would work whether evolution was true or not. And a lot of Jesuit priests have been using that particular argument with evolution to argue for God. It's just basically that the patterns of nature, the laws of nature, so that the mindless things of nature work towards the same goals, like an acorn growing up to be an oak tree, not an apple tree, shows that there's got to be a mind behind nature working through these natural laws and bringing these things about. Well, you could just insert evolution there, that since evolution is supposedly moving in one direction, there's got to be a mind behind it. And when I went to Catholic high school in the 1970s, I was taught theistic evolution. In fact, I was just basically taught evolution in my biology classes. And then when you'd ask them about creation and God, they'd say, well, God did it. God used evolution. And then they would just move on. So it was never really, it was kind of like the Pope said something that never really was. Now, the Pope said something that most Catholics already believed, but you will find a few Catholics out there that do argue really effectively against evolution. But what the Pope's saying is you don't have to do that. You could be a good Catholic and be a theistic evolutionist. Now, the mainline Protestant denominations, a lot of them are theistic evolutionists as well.
Am I correct when I assume that the United Nations Agenda 21 is just the result of all the trends that you've been talking about?
Yeah, I think this played a significant, Darwinian thought played a significant role in the thinking of the United Nations, and I think it's not a coincidence that their meditation room was founded and is maintained by Lucis Trust, which used to be Lucifer Publishing, but the book sales were reeled down, which is an offshoot of the American-based Theosophical Society.